Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of this reaction series to Oversimplified's French Revolution. Boy, the response yesterday was outstanding. Just couldn't believe how many people viewed, and we had by far our biggest day ever for new subscribers. Something like 2,800 new subscribers yesterday, and I'm sure it's mostly because of doing something from Oversimplified. But I also noticed that I had my biggest day ever in 4 years of my gaming channel, with over 300 new subs on the gaming channel, and I didn't even mention the gaming channel yesterday. I'm mentioning it now. So if you're into strategy gaming, historical gaming, things like that, there's a link in the description of this video and of all my videos to History Guy Gaming, which is the channel that I started with 4.5 years ago, and only branched out to doing this channel about 8 or 9 months ago. So if you're into that kind of stuff, check that out. Give that a subscribe if you would as well. Right now I've got 2 series that I'm doing. One's in Grand Tactician, the Civil War, and the other one is Crusader Kings 3. But I do a lot of other things from time to time. So we're going to dive right into part 2, but I just want to address one thing. Several of you correctly pointed out that I didn't really speak correctly about the nature of the Third Estate, and I put a pinned comment on the video from yesterday about that. And if you didn't see that video, the link's in the description. There were many educated people in the Third Estate. The Third Estate just was all of the commoners, but you had commoners who were lawyers and who were wealthy merchantmen, and so it was wrong of me to say that they weren't educated. What I really should have said was that the main difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution is that in America, most of the men who made up the leadership of the country during the Revolution had previous leadership experience, because many of them had served in state assemblies or colony assemblies, had been elected to civil government in one form or another. That's not to say that that wasn't happening in France. It just, there was a degree of experience there that didn't exist among the French leadership in the Third Estate. But thank you all for pointing that out. We're all here to learn. I do not know everything about every topic at all. So I appreciate all of you correcting me on that. Please continue to do that. That's how we all learn and make sure that we have the accurate information. Let's dive into part 2.
King Louis and his family were now in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where for the next couple of years, he watched as the revolutionary government began to strip away his power. And fearing for his safety, he had to stay on their good side. Hey, look who it is. It's my favorite revolutionaries. Yep, I'm your #1 fan. What can I do for you? Hey, King Louis. So we've made a few decisions. First, all of your friends in the nobility are going to have to pay taxes the same as everyone else. Great idea. I love it. And as a side note, the tax money can no longer pay for all your lavish parties. Great. I hate those parties. They're so awkward. And also, we're taking away your Porsche. Oh, come on! I mean, yay. The king continually...
And this is an important distinction to point out, because a lot of people are under the impression that the French Revolution, you have the Bastille in July 1789, and instantly they overthrow the king and he's beheaded, and it just kind of all happens at once. And it really didn't happen that way. Initially, the revolution was not did not happen with the intent of overthrowing the king. What they wanted to do was scale back his power and right many of the wrongs that they saw in what was happening. But the problem is, it just has to keep escalating because you have that constant conflict. There's some parallels here to the English Civil War, when you have the same thing happening with the English king, and he eventually ends up being beheaded, and they actually go away from the monarchy for a while.
Found demand after demand being made of him to prove his support for the revolution. On one occasion, a mob would invade the palace and demand he wear the revolutionary bonnet. This is the face of a man who is definitely pretending he wants to wear that bonnet. Now around here, I want to mention that one thing King Louis had a problem with was people constantly raiding his palace. But one thing he didn't have a problem with was raiding noobs on this video's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. Oh yeah. Seeing the situation rapidly turning against him, the king decided it might be a good idea to leave France and mount a campaign to retake his country from abroad.
Not a good idea.
For him, he was married to an Austrian. So on the night of June 20th, 1791, the king and his family disguised themselves as servants and attempted to flee to the Austrian Netherlands. The royal carriage made a stop in the town of Varennes, and the postmaster there was like, "Hey guys, what's up? Where are you off to? We are but a collection of inconspicuous servants heading for the border for no particular reason at all." Say, you, the fat one, You look kind of familiar. Aren't you the king? Nope. Let me see your passport.
And they were so close to getting out of the country when this happened. Imagine how differently history might have gone if they hadn't been stopped when they were.
It says here you're King Louis the 16th. Nope, not me. Take him away, boys. The king was promptly returned to Paris, but now the jig was up. His lack of support for the revolution was clear to all, and many considered him a straight-up traitor who tried to abandon his people. As a result, the new constitution of 1791 completely reduced his powers to that of a simple figurehead, a constitutional monarch. However, radicals, such as those in the Jacobin Club, were outraged that the king wasn't to be removed entirely. So a month later, these radicals staged a protest on the Champ de Mars, calling for the king's removal. The government of Paris feared an insurrection was mounting, and they sent the military to disperse the crowd. The confrontation escalated and resulted in the Revolutionary National Guard firing on a crowd of revolutionaries.
Where have you seen that before? Where things like that happen and it escalates and it throws the whole thing off. And yeah, this is absolutely true. Now you not only have the royalists versus the revolutionaries, now you have more extreme revolutionaries against other revolutionaries. And this happens a lot in these wars as well, where you have other factions and those factions fight for taking the vacuum of power that has been vacated by the king.
It was a massacre. The incident exposed a deep division within the Brotherhood of the Revolution. On one side, the moderates who wanted to keep the king as a figurehead. On the other, radicals who wanted to see the king deposed and heads roll. In the wake of the massacre, these radicals received a wave of support. And speaking of rolling heads, one form of equality the revolution introduced was equality in execution. This meant no more torturous drawing and quartering, no more inhumane hanging. They wanted all criminals, regardless of economic status, to receive the same penalty, a quick and painless one. Luckily, a man by the name of Dr. Joseph Guillotine had an idea. A heavy blade that falls like thunder. The head flies off, blood spurts, and the man is no more. The guillotine, otherwise known as the national razor.
So, interesting thing about the guillotine is that at some point in what becomes known as the Terror, there was a guy who was sentenced to death. And this was a situation that we'll get to this, I'm sure, but kind of like the Salem witch trials, where every neighbor who had a beef with the guy next door could accuse him of not fully supporting the revolution and have them sent to the guillotine. But at one point, one guy, I think he was a doctor, and he wanted to help solve a mystery, which was how long do you stay aware after your head's been cut off? And so he told a guy to watch his head, and he was going to blink as many times as he could. And I think he blinked for several seconds. A little creepy to think about.
The guillotine made its debut in 1791 as the new form of execution. The writings of Marat and others continued to call for the execution of anyone suspected of working against the revolution. For him, this included some members of the clergy and nobility who had previously benefited from the cruel system of inequality that existed before the revolution. In many parts of the countryside, local lords had found themselves become a target. Sire, the peasants, they're revolting. Oh, come on, that's a bit harsh. Sure, they smell a bit, but I wouldn't say they're revolting.
Man.
Oh, yes, I see what you mean. Increasingly, these French aristocrats began fleeing France to find solitude in other parts of Europe. And once again, fear began to take hold. The privileged classes of these foreign nations didn't like what they were seeing because they feared revolutionary ideas may spread to their own lands.
We talk about this all the time on this channel. Fear is an incredibly powerful motivator. Think about it in your own life. Think about how many things are driven from fear. And I'll give you a perfect example. A couple of weeks ago, they came on the news and said that there had been a bear spotted in our town. Now, where I live is a relatively urban area. It's a suburban area, but we don't live next to a national forest or anything like that. So bears are not a common occurrence around here. But as soon as I heard that there was a bear spotted, like a mile away, my first thought is to make sure my son's not playing outside. My 8-year-old, because the last thing I want is for him to run into a bear. I was motivated by fear in protecting my son. And so I brought him inside, even though maybe there wasn't anything to worry about. Sometimes fear is rational. Sometimes fear is very irrational. But fear motivates people and can sometimes cause people to do things they never otherwise would have done because of that fear.
The National Assembly, actually now the Legislative Assembly, feared that these nations may decide to attack. Then why don't we attack them first? No, you idiots, we are definitely not ready for war yet. Did somebody say something? France declared war on Austria in April 1792 and immediately got pummeled. It also didn't help that Austria's ally, Prussia, joined in the fighting. The Prussian Duke of Brunswick posted a letter warning the revolutionaries that if anything happened to the king, he would burn Paris to the ground. The Duke's letter proved to be a massive success in inspiring the people of Paris to do the exact opposite of what he intended. They were enraged by the threat, and on the 10th of August 1792, the tension in the city exploded, and a mob stormed the king's palace. Fighting broke out between the revolutionaries and the king's Swiss guard, with casualties in the hundreds. King Louis fled and took refuge in the chamber of the Legislative Assembly, where Robespierre and his radical Jacobins were gaining ever more power. Given the developing situation, the chamber decided to hold a vote, and in what some considered to be a second revolution, it was decided to suspend the monarchy entirely. King Louis XVI was now just plain old Louis, and he was sent to a prison cell where an eye could be kept on him. A month later, the newly established National Convention officially declared the French Republic, and society underwent a massive change. Enlightened ideas of democracy and equality were being implemented, but very quickly, these ideas seemed to become secondary to fear, paranoia, and a thirst for blood.
And this is not unique to France. This is something that has happened throughout history. So we can't look at France and say, man, what was wrong with you people? This happened all the time.
The new republic began working to violently remove any semblance of the old royalist regime. The church became a prime target. Priests who refused to take an oath to the revolution were deported or arrested. A new state-sponsored atheistic religion named the Cult of Reason was created as a replacement for the Catholic Church. Notre Dame, along with many other churches, had their religious treasures destroyed and were converted to temples of reason.
And one of the sad things, historically speaking, that happens during all of this is that at some point a mob goes into some of the churches, like Fontevraud, I think, is one of them, where you have the graves of people like the past French kings. You've got the grave of Richard the Lionheart, William the Conqueror, and they scatter the bones. And basically a lot of these graves were desecrated, destroyed, and the bodies lost forever.
Even the Christian calendar didn't survive, as a brand new revolutionary calendar was soon introduced. Hey honey, I'm home. Yeah, whatever, jerk. Whoa, what's wrong with you? You forgot. Forgot what? Everything. This entire year. My birthday was on the 3rd of Germinal, our anniversary was the 12th of Thermidor, and you promised that in Frimaire, we'd go on a romantic weekend trip to Venice. No, I said we'd do that in December. December hasn't been a thing for years. The government of Paris, now under the control of the radical sans-culottes, began rounding up suspected enemies of the revolution and sending them to prison in the thousands. Naturally, a large number of those arrested were members of the clergy and aristocracy. As France's foreign enemies continued to close in, panic spread. Georges Danton made impassioned calls for men to defend the Republic, and tens of thousands of troops left Paris for the front lines. However, in their absence, Paris was left to its own devices. As enemy troops arrived in Verdun, the people of Paris feared that their crowded prisons were becoming a breeding ground for counter-revolutionary conspiracy. What would happen if the Prussians reached Paris and freed the aristocrats? Marat believed he knew what would happen. The aristocrats would enact their vengeance on the people. Fearing those they had already imprisoned, mobs descended on Paris's prisons. They broke in, and during the brutal September massacres, aristocrats, priests, and others were tried and executed on the spot.
Here's another parallel to be seen between this and the Russian Revolution, where the reason that they end up executing the Romanov family is because the forces that were looking to free them were getting very, very close. They were within a couple of miles of Yekaterinburg, where they were being held, and they had to do something. And so that's when they decide to execute them. Same thing here. You've got Austrian forces moving their way toward Paris, and if they get there and they release all these people, so there's fear. There's fear of what happens. And again, this happens throughout history. When you overthrow a power, and that power still exists, even if it's in prison, it's still a threat because it becomes a focus for, man, if we can just get these people out. This happened in England a lot, where you'd have a king get deposed like Richard II, and they'd throw him into prison, and they can't just leave him there because people are going to rebel to try and get him back on the throne. So you've got to remove that source of rebellion.
even women and children weren't spared. With over 1,600 victims, word of the massacre spread across Europe. One British newspaper wondered, are these the rights of man? Is this the liberty of human nature? But there was still one man in particular that Robespierre and his radicals really wanted to see executed. Austria and Prussia pledged that after they defeated France, they'd return King Louis to the throne. Well, checkmate Austria and Prussia, because you can't return a man to the throne if he's already dead. Citizen Louis Capet was put on trial for treason. Obviously, he was found guilty, but his punishment was less certain. Many moderates wanted to simply deport him, but Robespierre insisted the revolution could only live if the king was dead. A vote was held, and by just one vote, Louis was sentenced to the guillotine.
Look at that. It wasn't this massive undercurrent of wanting him to die. It wasn't this overwhelming factor where everybody wanted the king to die. It was by one vote. And you have to wonder, if the vote had gone the other way, what might have happened. If they would have held another vote, if they would have maybe gone after the people who voted against it. I feel like had the vote gone the other way and it was still close, that doesn't necessarily mean Louis was out of the woods.
If you don't mind, I'd like to say a few words first. Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. Wait, you're too loud. They can't hear me. Hang on, I haven't finished yet. Wait, dude. Uncool. In her prison cell, Marie Antoinette heard the guns fire, signaling her husband's death. Before long, she would meet the same fate. Back on the war front, France defied all expectations and actually managed to push the enemy back. But then more countries joined the coalition against France, and it all went to pot again. What do? Conscript the masses. The National Convention introduced a conscription law, with each regional department having to meet a certain quota of men for the army. However, not everyone was happy with this new law. You see, while Paris was definitely a hotbed for radical revolutionary fervor, some of the regions outside of Paris weren't quite so keen on the revolution. Some were largely still conservative, still supported the church, and just didn't suffer from that much inequality before the revolution. So as the revolution turned increasingly violent and anti-Christian, many were outraged. Now, they were being conscripted to fight for the new republic they hated.
Isn't it interesting how often this happens, that a revolution ends up becoming the very thing that it was rebelling against? It ends up taking on some of the same things. In the American Civil War, the whole argument was, we're seceding, so we have the right to self-determination. We want, and they throw out states' rights a lot. We want each state to determine whether or not they want to have slavery. We want each state to determine for themselves. And then the entire time the Civil War is going on, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, is lamenting the fact that he doesn't have the same strong central authority that Abraham Lincoln enjoys. So the very thing they rebelled against is the very thing he says he needs in order to be able to win. The same thing's happening here.
That was the last straw. Counter-revolutionary uprisings erupted in a number of regions across France. Some would last for years, such as in the northwest, where a large-scale uprising was led by the Owls. Why were they called the Owls? Because their leader was named Jean Owl. Why was he called Jean Owl? Possibly because he could do a really good impression of an owl. Really? That's what we're going with? Owls? Just because this guy can do an impression of one? Hit him with it, Jean. Hoot, hoot. Yeah, okay, that's pretty good. The Chouannerie uprising lasted all the way until 1800. In the summer of 1793, the southern city of Toulon invited the British Navy over for some tea and crumpets, and then they asked if they'd possibly like to stay and occupy the city. Being an important naval base, this was a heavy blow to the Republic, who sent a relatively unknown young
Napoleon
captain by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte to help stage the siege of the city. Toulon was recaptured by France in the winter, and for his service, Napoleon was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. The most infamous revolution, however, occurred in the Vendée region. Throughout 1793, revolutionary forces clashed with the region's Catholic and Royal Army. The Republic defeated the counter-revolution through cruel pacification. In particular, General Jean-Baptiste Carrier committed brutal atrocities. In one instance, he had thousands of civilians, priests, women, and children tied to ships, which were then sunk. Carrier would later be found guilty of war crimes and executed. Back in Paris, the government was still dominated by moderates. With the war going badly, revolts in the provinces, and the economy getting worse, it seemed the government just wasn't doing a very good job. Radicals' fear for the safety of the revolution intensified, and Marat even began calling for the moderates in the government to be executed. In return, the moderates called for the arrest of Marat. This led to a chain of events with the two sides in heated conflict. Robespierre declared the Jacobins to be an insurrection and called on the people to arm themselves. It all ended on the 31st of May 1793 with the National Convention surrounded by radical sans-culottes and 29 moderate Girondin politicians arrested. From this moment on, the moderates ceased to be a political force.
And it's all downhill
and
now.
His radicals would be in almost total control of the government. And this brings us to the story of a woman named Charlotte Corday.
Oh yeah.
Charlotte lived in the northwest city of Caen, and like many in the area, was horrified at the rapid radicalization and increasing violence of the revolution. And the man she blamed more than anyone was Jean-Paul Marat.
And there is, I don't want to get ahead of myself too much, but there's a very famous painting of the incident that they're about to talk about.
She wanted to bring peace back to France, and so she did something drastic. She traveled to Paris and told Marat she had a list of enemies for him to publish in his paper. Marat eagerly invited her in for a meeting. So where's that list of enemies you promised me? Here it is. Wait a minute. This isn't a list of enemies. It just says, yippee-ki-yay, mother... And just like that, Marat
There's the painting.
was no more. Charlotte was quickly arrested and sent to the guillotine. Her dream of restoring peace, however, died with her. Marat became a martyr. In temples of reason, symbols of the dead Marat became the new crucifix. In death, he became an even more powerful inspiration for the extreme levels of violence that were about to rip throughout the new republic.
And I think at some point they switched. I don't know if it happened before or after, but it wasn't always Temple of Reason. At some point they go to the temple, it becomes the cult of the Supreme Being. It's more of a deism sort of thing. And deism was very popular at this point. Some of the American founding fathers were deists as well. Certainly Thomas Jefferson was. The idea behind deism was that it was a belief that there is a God or some kind of supreme being, a higher power, who created the world, spun everything in motion, but then backed out and doesn't have interaction with his creation. So he's kind of out there, but he's not the God of the Bible or the the Quran or the Torah or anything like that. And Thomas Jefferson even cut had a version of the Bible where he cut all the supernatural stuff out and just left to make his own version that fit with his idea of deism.
That's right. Here comes the Reign of Terror. If you thought this revolution already sounds pretty violent, well, you ain't seen nothing yet, son.
Yep.
The radicals were now in control, and they believed not only was France surrounded by foreign enemies, but that within the masses, there were also plenty of internal ones too. Individuals not loyal to the revolution, conspiring to bring about its downfall.
So when revolutions happen, there's one of two ways you can really go. It can become inward fighting, like what we're going to see here and what we've been seeing here, where factions destroy each other from within, or they can unite behind something. And eventually that happens in France once the infighting comes to an end. But like in America, for example, you had Thomas Paine writing these pamphlets, Common Sense, and the follow-ups to it. And that got everybody united behind a common cause. So you didn't have the factions to the same degree. You did have some because you had a lot of loyalists. Or it can go this direction, which is infighting, and instead of focusing on an enemy without that you can rally together and fight, you end up internalizing it, and it just becomes a bloody mess as you just tear each other to shreds.
Robespierre and the rest of the radical faction were having none of it. A new committee of public safety was established with 12 members. Its purpose was to protect the new French Republic from its enemies, and it basically became a 12-man dictatorship with Robespierre as its leading voice. The Revolutionary Tribunal was also reinstated, a special court created to streamline the process of trying suspected enemies and handing out their death sentences. With these two new institutions, Robespierre wanted to scare France's enemies straight. In September 1793, it was announced that terror would be the order of the day. In other words, fear had become official government policy.
Yep.
And from then onwards, we enter into the period known as the Reign of Terror. Spies and secret police were everywhere and watched the people closely. France's public had to be extremely careful what they said and how they behaved. Obviously, criticizing this new system, or the government, would quickly have you sent off to the guillotine. But that's not all. Even the most minor offense could have you tried before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Hello, Citizen Martin. Hello, Monsieur Dubois. Monsieur? Did I just hear you say monsieur? That's the old style of address, my friend. To the guillotine! You know what? I didn't like him, but I do feel kinda bad for the king and his family. Oof, expressing sympathy for the royal family, are we? To the guillotine!
This is not a overstatement of what was going on. This is literally how bad it was. Imagine how fear must have gripped these people that you, like, the slightest, most innocent comment could get you sent to the guillotine. If one person here, and you didn't even have to do anything wrong. If somebody didn't like you and they just accused you of saying something wrong, that could be enough.
12 sous for a loaf of bread? That's way overpriced. To the guillotine. Man, this bread line is taking forever. To the guillotine. And you look like you're thinking anti-revolutionary thoughts. To the guillotine. Max, we're sending way too many people to the guillotine. To the guillotine! Chop, 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 chop. It was insane. All across France, about 40,000 people were killed for suspected crimes against liberty. Let's say your neighbor won't stop mowing the lawn at 7 in the morning. Well, then all you gotta do is tell the government they've been talking smack about the revolution. And there's a good chance they'll end up in front of the Revolutionary Tribunal.
So I'm curious to know what the population of France was at this time and how this compares in terms of the percentage of people that actually died. Let's look that up. Time to pull out the glasses. So it looks like in 1700, the population of France was nearly 20 million, and it was 29 million by 1800. So 1784, it's about 25 million. So let's say probably 26, maybe 27 million people by that point. I'm just curious to know kind of what kind of a percentage we're looking at as far as the number of people who died. So 40,000 people out of 27 million. I mean, I guess it's not that high an amount. You're looking at 0.1%. So it's a small number, but man, still, that's 40,000 people.
Maybe they'll even be executed, taking a metaphorical load off your shoulders and a literal one off theirs. The most prominent victim of the Reign of Terror was a certain Marie Antoinette, who was finally tried and found guilty of treason in 1793.
Wait. Is that an AT-AT, an AT-AT? You know, the big things from Star Wars? I had one of those as a kid. I had the toy. That's fantastic. I love just the random Star Wars reference there.
She expected she'd be brought to the guillotine in a royal carriage, fit for a queen. All the Republic could provide for her, however, was a wooden tumbril. At 37 years old, the most hated woman in French history met her end on the 16th of October, 1793. Robespierre had saved the revolution through terror. Internal dissent was being suppressed. The food situation was no longer quite as bad. Even the French military had got its act together again and pummeled the Allies at the Battle of Fleurus. For Danton and his followers, the time was right to try to normalize the French Republic. Hey Robespierre, so we were thinking that since things are finally going better, maybe we should rein in the terror. And while we're on it, we could possibly start taking it easier on the church, and also try to end this costly war. Oh, crap. As time went on, Robespierre seemed to go, for lack of a better term, a bit mental.
Yeah.
He was hell-bent on creating what he called a republic of virtue, and for him, this meant amping up the bloodshed even more. Throughout the spring and summer of 1794, executions reached an unprecedented level during a period known as the Great Terror. Even those closest to him found their way to the guillotine if they dared oppose his ideas and actions, and he began alienating himself from the rest of the convention. He created a new deistic religion called the Cult of the Supreme Being, along with the new annual Festival of the Supreme Being. Man, I think Robespierre is really starting to lose it. He thinks he's a god or something.
Don't say that.
Nonsense. Sure, he's gone a little extreme, but he doesn't think he's a god. My children, bathe your immortal souls in the virtue of my republic. Okay, yeah. He's completely lost it. Robespierre's ultimate mistake, however, came on July 26th, when he made a speech to the National Convention, in which he said this: I have in my hand a brand new list of enemies to be sent to the guillotine, and many of you are on this list, but I'm not going to tell you who yet. What do you think of that? I think we should send Robespierre to the guillotine first. All in favor? No. 2 days later, Robespierre became the final victim of the monstrous terror and paranoia he had created. Many historical accounts of the revolution end here, with the death of Robespierre and his terror. But the revolution officially continued for another 5 years, until 1799. So what happened between now and then? Well, after the fall of Robespierre, a more moderate political group called the Thermidorians took control of the convention. They wanted to restore stability to the government. Now, Robespierre's allies and other radicals who had fueled the terror themselves became the target of political suppression. Bourgeois street fighters took on the radical sans-culottes in the streets during a period named the White Terror. In 1795, the Thermidorians drafted a new constitution and created a government called the Directory, with the purpose of preventing power from being able to fall into the hands of a single individual again.
Which it's about to do in the form of Napoleon.
As this new government was being established, royalists who wanted to bring the monarchy back to France saw this moment as an opportunity to strike. They staged an insurrection in Paris and battled with the National Guard in the streets. Luckily, one Napoleon Bonaparte happened to be in Paris at the time, and he took control of the situation, firing on the crowd and putting down the insurrection. From this moment on, the people of Paris would never again be able to stage a popular uprising and lost their control over the revolution. For his actions, Napoleon became a general and was sent to take control of the French armies in Italy. The new Directory remained a fairly ineffective government for the remainder of the revolution. It was plagued with corruption and struggled to keep the economy afloat, and as a result, wasn't very popular. For the people of France, with the strict social customs of both royalist France and the terror gone, they didn't really know what to do with themselves. Men no longer removed their hats when talking to women. Different classes began intermingling, and a publication began circulating that looked a lot like a modern dating app. It was social anarchy. Outside of France, the war continued. In 1795, France took the Netherlands, where they set up a puppet state. Then they negotiated both Prussia and Spain out of the war. The British attempted to land French royalists in the west to reinforce rebellion, but that plan failed. In 1796, the French planned a three-pronged attack with the aim of marching on Vienna and knocking Austria out of the war. The two northern armies were defeated and forced to retreat. However, Napoleon in the south, with groundbreaking military strategy, won battle after battle after battle. He pushed the Austrians out of Italy and began closing in on Vienna. The Austrians freaked out, and Napoleon oversaw the signing of a peace treaty. He had almost single-handedly knocked Austria out of the war, and by the way, he was only 28, so maybe it's about time you moved out of your mom's basement.
He was only 28. He was not as short as everybody thinks he was. He was probably about 5'8", which is pretty average height for the time. And he ends up, interestingly, later on in his life, when he becomes emperor, marrying an Austrian princess. So once again, you have that kind of link between France and Austria. But that, in and of itself, Napoleon's story is a fascinating one. And at least as of now, the vote over on Patreon is going in the direction of us diving into Epic History TV's Napoleonic War series, which I hope we will be able to do without copyright strikes. I had trouble with that before, so I'm going to be really careful about that, because you get 3 of those and you lose your channel. So we'll see what happens, but I definitely want to dive into some of Napoleon's history one way or another.
Napoleon became a famed hero among the French people, but his aspirations were still higher. He briefly went off to Egypt and discovered a bunch of gnarly Egyptian stuff, but then the British destroyed his fleet and trapped his forces. Say, Napoleon, sir, you're not going to leave us here stuck in Egypt and return to France, are you?
Yeah.
Nonsense, my boy. I would never dream of abandoning my loyal soldiers. Wow, what's that over there? On his return to Paris, Napoleon found himself to be extremely popular, and the government extremely unpopular, and he started getting some power-hungry ideas. Conveniently, a politician named Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès approached Napoleon and said, "Hey man, since you're so popular, do you want to help me stage a coup?" "Great idea. Let's stage a coup, and then I'll coup you." What? Napoleon, with the help of his politician brother, entered the government chamber, possibly got punched in the face, and finally his troops intimidated the council to dissolve the government and create a new constitution that basically made Napoleon a dictator. So there you have it, the French Revolution, born with the great promise of liberty and equality. The common people dared challenge an oppressive system that had existed for centuries, but before they knew it, they found liberty sidelined by terror, equality that possibly didn't quite hit the mark, and an absolute monarchy replaced by an absolute dictator. Napoleon began stabilizing French society. He restored the Catholic Church and got rid of that crazy calendar, among other things. But he remained ever ambitious. He was France's first consul, but he slept soundly at night dreaming of being something even bigger. Napoleon's expansionist aspirations, combined with the ongoing conflict in Europe, would eventually lead the continent into a huge conflict known today as...
which I guess we're going to get at some point from Oversimplified, and we will certainly dive into that when the time comes. I'm excited to dive into that history at some point. But that's it for now. Let me know your thoughts. Add to the discussion. Let's continue this conversation. The whole point of these reaction videos is to give us an opportunity to talk and to learn and to all develop what we know about history and get a little bit deeper insight into those things. So use that comment section below for that. Hit the like button if you would. Check out my gaming channel. Check out some of the other links in the description below, and we'll see you again tomorrow with another reaction. Thanks for watching.